Hi, welcome everybody who's joining. We'll just wait one more minute because I see lots of people clicking online and then we'll start. Okay, I think we can begin. I see 24 people or so on the call. So just to check, Susie, have you just started the recording once we start? So hi, everybody to join. I'm Sarah Rosenberg-Janssen. For those of you who don't already recognize my very irritating voice, welcome to our working group call on data and evidence. We have these every couple of months to sort of keep the momentum for our working group moving. And today's one will focus on moving towards standardization. Just because some of you are new to the Zoom format, just to highlight a couple of things on the sort of procedural side before we get started. In the Zoom screen, you'll see at the bottom left hand or somewhere in your app, a little button that says mute. You're currently all muted, so if anybody wants to discuss anything during the discussion segment, then please just click unmute and then we'll be able to hear you. Another thing to note is that you can see all the other participants by clicking the participant list. And there's also a chat function. So if you click on the chat button, you can message either everyone on the chat or people individually. And within that function, you can also do what they call raise a hand, which basically alerts us as organizers that you want to say something if you don't want to interrupt the flow. So feel free to use those functions or write questions in the chat box as well. Great. In which case, I will get started. Just to let you know that we are recording the call today so that people who can't attend can listen in after this. And yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. So if we jump to the next slide. Great, thanks, Susie. Welcome. The hosts for today's call are myself, Sarah Rosenberg-Janssen, Susie Huber from the GPA, and James Hayslip from UNHCR. We are the three co-chairs of the Data and Evidence Working Group. And just two quick announcements before we get started on today's call. Firstly, for those of you who don't already know, the GPA has a new website, which has some resources and blogs and things on there. And there's also a new LinkedIn practitioners group, which I think most of you are already in, but feel free to join if you're not and engage with different job announcements and technical resources that we'll be posting there. Great, next slide, please. So sorry for the very wordy slide, but the purpose of today's call is a bit different from a couple of our previous calls. We wanted to use this much more as a working group call to open up the discussion and start working together on the topic of data and indicators. This is a topic that's been identified from within the community as quite an urgent one to get started on, and also the GPA Steering Committee have it as one of their priority focus areas. So today we'll be focusing on data in practice and potentially moving towards standardization. That'll mean focusing on the different technical types of data, what data is used for, what types of indicators are used, what types of methodologies are used. So it might be quite a techie call for those of us who don't have technical backgrounds. So if you do have questions, clarification questions about terminology, please use the group chat to ask those questions. And a couple of us who are more technical will try and answer those. The purpose of the call is really to get a couple of us who are working within agencies and within institutions on energy data and indicators to work together to discuss core areas of technical alignment and to receive feedback from everybody on the call on what types of data and indicators it would be useful for you guys to have and see. With the aim that this will sort of be a springboard discussion to get us started on a more detailed work plan on actually going out and collecting some data and starting to analyze that and making that publicly available. So that's all I wanted to say on that one. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda for today. We'll just spend sort of an hour or so having 10-minute snapshot presentations from James Hayslip at UNHCR, Florent Eville at FAO, Eva Mack at IOM, and Owen Graffam at Chatham House. And they will present all the different types of indicators and data that their organizations currently use. In the future, we will also be working with WFP on this topic as well. So hello to anybody from WFP who was on the call. And then we'll plan to have a structured brainstorm for the second half of the call. And that is really open for everybody. So please feel free to contribute and ask questions. Also highlight your own sources of data and what you're working on. And we will try and structure that discussion roughly within the sort of 4 or 5 bullet points listed there around what is data for, and the initial indicator mapping that we're planning to conduct, the different types of coordination and standardization even possible within this area, and also talking about the different online data sharing platforms and what people do so far. And then we'll close up in about an hour and a half, depending on how the discussion goes. Next slide, please. Great, and I've asked all of the speakers to present in this kind of format. So firstly, they'll talk about the current state of play, and then they'll move on to future needs. And that's quite an important distinction. That's looking more at what organizations would do if they had time, capacity, money, and start to invest in this. And then thirdly, talking about the different methods for collecting data. So that's where we might get a bit more technical and a bit more detailed, and the types of data sharing possible. So all the presenters will roughly talk in that order about things. I think that's all I wanted to do as my little introduction. So with that, I think we can start straight away with James. Jump to the next slide, please. Yeah, great. So over to you, James, for the UNHCR piece. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those in the US. I guess like a lot of you, I am at home and with a child running around, so apologies in advance if there's some screaming or interruptions. But at least it's the same for all of us, so that's a great leveler. And I will try and be brief with these slides because I'm conscious that together we've got quite a lot. So yeah. If we just get to the next one. So what do we currently use energy data for? So we have our Clean Energy Challenge baseline now, which is the sort of global reporting. Now that's, we have a visualization, which I think most of you have seen. That is informed by a sort of very rough and ready spreadsheet covering about 100 settlements, mostly in Africa. Now, the idea of that is to sort of track progress towards a sort of population-wide progress against SDG 7, broadly speaking. So access to energy and the use of renewables in powering basic infrastructure, etc. So it kind of corresponds to the strategy, which is what the challenge sort of is based on. And then we have a little bit of household consumption data preferences and stuff informed by some specific projects like RE4R. It's not in any way systematic. So that's ad hoc, as is, I would say, sort of general research and evidence that is gathered through, country-specific missions, most of which are used to inform sort of new energy programming. Now, none of this is, as I say, systematic. So that is the honest truth of the situation. Oh, next slide. Yeah, okay. So current use. This is a screenshot of the energy information system. So this is managed by the research and analytics team, which is headed by Teresa Beltramo in the Division of Resilience and Solutions, which is where I am also based in that same division. I think a lot of you are familiar with EIS, and this is the only sort of standardized and updated, systematic, if you like, data gathering on energy, but it is a assessment. It's data that's used for monitoring and evaluation purposes. So it's, in other words, to understand the impact of an intervention. So not data necessarily intended to inform new projects or programs. And I think that's an important clarification to make. And also it has a limited geographical scope, 14 countries, mostly in Africa. Next slide. Oh, I put those terrible animations in. So, okay, so this is the screenshot of the Clean Energy Challenge baseline visualization, which came out just before the Global Refugee Forum. And as I mentioned earlier, this is intended to sort of provide a very rough indication of the size of the challenge and the whereabouts, a kind of broad cut, if you like, of reality. But ultimately to sort of identify priority areas and inform new projects or programs against SDG 7. So this is population-wide data. And as I say, it was sort of gathered relatively in a sort of quick and dirty manner. But this is something that we want to improve upon, expand, both in terms of the indicators and the data that's gathered to inform it, and also geographically. So at the moment, it's covering about 100 settlements from an estimated total of 350 that UNHCR is overseeing. Next slide. In terms of indicators, now this is a screenshot of the all of the indicators that inform the EIS. So that's, again, the progress on monitoring and evaluation. And it's split between, it's household focused, it's population specific. So it's only monitoring interventions at the household level where there has been an intervention, and it's split between clean cooking or cooking interventions and lighting. And those are the two areas in which the indicators focus on. And some of these can be used for our programming purposes, but most of them are just intended for impact monitoring. Next slide. And here's a screenshot of all of the indicators that we have against the 4 outcome areas of the strategy, the Global Strategy for Sustainable Energy, which was published finally in October last year. Now, counting up all of those indicators, which are kind of global indicators against each of the outcomes, we have 23, which makes us a little bit nervous. And some of them, if you look at them, I wouldn't say crucial or essential. And I think what we're discussing is whether and how we should rationalize these and actually sort of focus on 1 or 2 key outcome indicators at the global level, so that we can just make our lives a bit simpler. And for internal purposes, we also need to align this with our results-based management indicators. So there's lots of different levels of indicators for different purposes, and we just want to get them all sort of aligned. So that's partly an internal struggle. Challenge, but for the sake of this call and for the wider community, I think it would be good to share indicators and have a discussion about which would be most useful, most relevant for these outcome areas, which I don't think we're looking to change the outcome areas themselves. Although personally, I would like to have something a bit more concrete on outcome 2, you know, whether we refer to a specific performance target for clean cooking. But anyway, putting that aside, those are the indicators for the strategy. So next slide. And here is a screenshot of all the indicators that underpin the Clean Energy Challenge database. So you can't download that data, that spreadsheet from the portal. But what I've done here is just basically, I have that data, of course, but I also have the indicators here, and then the sort of the metric or type of indicator it is. And I've just put a few quick comments on what we could change or improve, because again, as I said, that was a sort of first rough and ready, quick and dirty, rather, visualization ahead of the Global Refugee Forum. So it served its purpose, but we need to improve and expand upon it. And in yellow at the bottom, I've put just a first brainstorm of missing or desirable indicators or data points, things that we might want to add. Again, trying to align this with the strategy and the Clean Energy Challenge. And some of this may be available elsewhere, some of it not. And that's what we need to discuss. Instead of going out there and gathering things that already exist. Okay, next slide. Okay, what do we need? Now, yeah, so this is, again, I think data is very much, you know, horses for courses. So the question really is, what are we trying to achieve, and what does data, how does data help us achieve that? So, you know, in our unit, in the Energy and Environment unit of DRS, we're very much concerned about with informing new project interventions. So how do we, what data can we gather, and evidence and analysis can we conduct to you know, communicate the opportunities and the kinds of projects and investment that we need to push us towards, you know, the ambitions of SDG 7. So in that sense, it's the kind of energy feasibility assessments that are circled there on the sort of purple circle on the top left there, and at the bottom, feeding into new program design. And then, of course, you know, it operates in parallel with the work that Teresa is doing on monitoring and evaluation. And in fact, you know, she will have nothing to monitor or evaluate if we don't develop new interventions. So, you know, they're not the same thing, and they serve different purposes. So I think our real need is on the data to inform projects and programs. But that's the short answer. Next slide. Yeah. So here, for example. Yeah, so this is kind of repeats what I've just said, but I think as a sort of policy position, if I can say that, you know, we are, as far as possible, trying to embrace market-based solutions to clean energy access in displacement. And, you know, we're taking a lot of our cues from the insights and analysis that was conducted by the MEI project, which of course was very strong on market creation and commercial opportunities, especially in the protracted situations, the more stable and older settlements in Africa, for example. But we need, you know, reliable and site-specific data on some additional points, which we currently don't have systematically. Now, some of these are things like household income. This is, I think, something we all struggle with. It's inherently difficult to secure in any reliable way, or any systematic way. Methodologically, it's very challenging. So that will always be, I think, something we'll have to work around and look for proxies or other sort of creative ways of trying to get insights on purchasing power, etc. But we can more easily investigate willingness to pay for specific clean energy technologies. We don't currently have that, only sort of in some ad hoc studies. And other wider issues, again, sort of thinking in more development terms, and the data and information that would be used by the development sector to inform, you know, market creation plans. So the number and diversity of suppliers operating in and around refugee communities, for example, something systematic on that, I think would be very useful. And if we are to access carbon financing in any systematic or sort of large scale way, then we need some data and calculations on carbon intensity, I think, of specific technologies against a baseline. Of course, that's the key there, so that we can calculate the carbon mitigation potential and the financial value of that. So this is not exhaustive. This is just a sort of suggestion of some areas where we need more data, I think. And then for the institutional power, because most of my thoughts and focus is on the household and the refugee as beneficiaries, because that's really the core focus of the UNHCR energy strategy. But at the same time, and I was reminded of this by Sarah the other day, actually, that we need, you know, obviously the GPA is a much broader church and is concerned also with data for energy at the institutional level, so our own operations, which is what we're thinking of as a sort of greening of operations, the decarbonisation of UNHCR's own operations, our own footprint. This is not actually part of the energy strategy per se. And so, in fact, internally, this is most likely going to be something not separated from, but has a slightly different reporting line going up to the Deputy High Commissioner, which I think is great for that agenda, so that it has a strong high-level political support. But of course, the strategy is focused on the refugees. But the point being, we also need reliable, comparable, systematic data for institutional power needs. So annualized load profiles for our operations, how many kilowatt hours are we consuming and what is the profile of that demand. We have very precious little data at the moment on that, and it's mostly coming from some of our dedicated energy officers through NORCAP in the field. Otherwise, it's kind of incidental almost. And I think an easy way to calculate the efficiency and CO2 performance of our power consumption is by looking at the number of liters of diesel it takes to generate 1 kilowatt hour of power. And that seems to capture quite a lot of things. That would be a very useful data point, I think, and something that we do hope to gather more systematically through the distribution of power, what do you call them? These monitoring, magnets they use to monitor power consumption. And that there is a program to distribute that amongst our operations. So some of it's being looked at, and other bits not so much yet. But I think it'd be very good to have a conversation and compare notes. I know that WFP are very advanced on this particular agenda. So I think we could all learn a lot from what WFP have done. Okay, next slide. Oh yeah, that's my empty one. So I was supposed to get some input from colleagues internally. I didn't manage to get around to that. So we can skip that one. What would be useful? Methodologies. Okay, so with Teresa's EIS is survey based, and this is all quantitative data that's quite systematic, quite established, I would say. Some qualitative data through focus groups and interviews is conducted by partner projects, MEI in the past, and RE4R, which is ongoing. Nothing systematic. Equally, data on market information is not systematic, but is again gathered through various external research projects, partners. Situational analysis, yeah, again, mostly ad hoc studies conducted either by country missions, country operations, or missions from HQ. Now we have the growing population of NORCAP deployees. And most of this information is sort of not online yet, but it certainly could be. But otherwise, in general, I think we rely strongly on external research partners who have their own methodologies, basically. Okay, next slide. I can't remember how many more I have now. Okay, so going back to project design, again, that's the sort of my personal concern with looking at the strategy. What data and evidence do we need to inform projects, and how much information is a sort of acceptable minimum for that? I think a lot of you will be very familiar to the point of boredom with my little pet project in Tanzania, which is now almost 3 years ago. I conducted this work with Mark Gibson when he was our man in Tanzania, and this was demand driven in the sense that Mark was in Dar es Salaam and he asked for help. At that time I was working as an external research partner at UNEP-DTU. We surveyed 500 households, including data on fuel expenditure, time spent collecting wood fuel, and a willingness to pay scenario. The key information here, if you like, if we really boil it down, is that you have a large, more than half of the households spending an average of $12 US per month on wood, fuel, or charcoal, which is very, very high in African terms, certainly at least 3 or 4 times higher than the average in Tanzania. Almost 100% willingness to pay for LPG fuel, liquid petroleum gas, following a pilot study. And that mainly reflects the time and effort spent on collecting wood fuel, and as well as the financial costs. So this was used basically to inform a market creation plan in and around Nyarugusu, the study site, and in partnership with, what was key here is that working, as an external researcher, working with the country office to push, design a market creation plan, develop a concept note for that, share it with the government who approved it, and then using that approval to help get funding, to get investment, blah, blah, blah. It's a whole kind of life cycle, if you like. So the point with this slide is just to indicate the role of data and evidence and research, I would say more broadly, in designing new clean energy project interventions. And it's a whole kind of process, and we can't drop the ball at any point, because I think often researchers come in, they do their work, they do a nice report, hand it over, and hope that somebody picks it up and runs with it. In reality, that rarely happens, often because there's a staff turnover, people move on, and things get lost or forgotten. And that's a big systemic problem we have. So, trying to be, having a unit that is responsible for pushing this forward through to completion, I think is fundamental to delivery in the bigger picture. So, okay, next slide. I think this should be the last one. Okay, where is data kept? Good question. So various sort of country-specific reports, and I see things like rapid needs assessments, which is basically somebody goes down from HQ for 2 weeks or something and tries to suck up as much information as they can. That's mostly it's digitized. Nothing is, let's say, on just paper, pen and paper these days, but it's not gathered or put in anywhere systematically, apart from what I have gathered in a Google Drive, where the mouse cursor is basically down there. You'll find 80 reports across various African operations that I've gathered. I think there's 12 countries, and I've used that. There's also a spreadsheet which I developed with Teresa and her team to extrapolate, all of the relevant data for energy programming, which we shared with the SMAP teams a few months ago, end of last year. And that covers 26 settlements across 10 countries. And that is basically what we have in Africa. And that's because, I didn't go beyond that because it wasn't my TOR, and also I'm only one person. I couldn't really do much more in terms of geographical scope. So that's as systematic as we have on data for programming. And then of course, what is publicly online is the EIS portal, and Teresa's data, that's all available online. And we also have the micro data library, which is going to be managed or part of what is now called the Global Data Service, which is, oh, what's that? Somebody scribbled, which is part of the Copenhagen team, UNHCR team in Copenhagen. So, but that is, there's nothing yet energy specific in the micro data library, but there's no reason why it can't be. So my sort of contribution in terms of, when it comes to discussing data sharing, is that we could seek to use that microdata library as a repository for all humanitarian energy across the different agencies. That's one option. I'm not pushing that, but it's just a suggestion. And with that, I think that's the last slide, isn't it? Oh no. And there's the screenshot of the microdata library and a couple of links, a link to the EIS, link to the Clean Energy Challenge baseline, and the microdata library, and that's it. Okay, cheers.
Great, thank you, James. That was really helpful little snapshot. Just before we move on to Florent, does anybody have any quick little questions or clarification questions for James? There will be a good half an hour, 40 minutes to discuss this in detail, but for clarification questions, does anybody have any? Please unmute yourself if so. Nope, good. Okay, in which case I'll hand over to Florent, who's from FAO, to give his piece about what FAO are doing on indicators and energy.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining the call today. I will try to be brief. Just one thing on FAO. So FAO is a member-based organization, so it means that we have 190 countries that are our members. So that will have an influence also on the type of data that we have. So for FAO, energy is energy for food security, and also FAO is responsible for the agricultural sector, so meaning the crop, livestock, forestry, and fisheries. So FAO is responsible for the management of these sectors. And then the second point is energy in agriculture. That might be also useful in humanitarian settings. We can go to the first slide. Okay, so the same concept as James before, we were asked to answer a couple of questions. So is FAO collecting global energy needs data? Yes, partially on wood fuels. Project planning data, yes. We do collect data related to energy for needs assessment for food security projects, and then we do specific ad hoc, which will supply an energy demand assessment. Research and evidence, yes, again, the wood fuel supply and energy demand assessment, and then monitoring and progress data. Of course, whenever we have a project, we monitor the impact of this project, and if it's an energy-related project, we monitor them. I'm also going to discuss a bit about RIMA, the Resilience Index Matrix Analysis, which measure resilience in general. And RIMA is step by step becoming the norm for monitoring projects within FAO, and it has a very simple question on energy. And then we also have bioenergy and food security assessment at country level, but these are mostly for developing countries, so not in emergencies. We can move to the next slide. So this is the what we call the FRAS, the Global Forest Resource Assessment. It's done every 5 years, and it relies on the data of the member states. So meaning we ask all our member states to provide us with data on the state of forest. So the table you have below is just a snapshot on the different questions that we ask. So basically it's done every 5 years. So for us, it gives us trends in terms of wood fuel removal in different countries. I also add a little picture of the key messages from the FRA to show you that in low-income countries, 93% of the wood removal are for wood fuel, whereas in high-income countries, they are for industrial grown wood. We can move to the next slide. Then we do what we call wood fuel supply and energy demand assessment. So these are ad hoc assessments. So the methodology was done in 2016 together with UNHCR. That's the technical handbook. So as soon as you will receive the slide, you will have the link to all these publications. So basically, there are 3 parts on the wood fuel supply and energy demand assessment. So the first part is to have quantitative energy data as well as qualitative. So quantitative through a survey, as it was explained by James, and qualitative through focus group discussions. Then we have the forestry colleagues that are running what we call small-scale forest inventory, and then the GIS colleagues working for the Red Plus team, matching the data between the forest inventory and the land use change using satellite imagery. So it's just to present you the different studies that we have done over the last years. We are about to publish one on Niger, so that's why you don't have the document for Niger yet. Okay, move to the next slide. Okay, so as I said in the introduction, RIMA is becoming the norm in terms of assessment of resilience. So basically, so I'm going to use a shortcut, but so we used to call like rehabilitation or humanitarian settings the context where we intervene after a conflict, during a conflict, or after climate event. And more we move to this notion of resilience. So I'm not going to explain the notion of resilience today, but so the RIMA analysis measures resilience through the Resilience Capacity Index and the Resilience Structure Matrix. So basically, it's an econometric methodology. And to measure the Resilience Capacity Index, we have the 4 pillars. So adaptive capacity, social safety net, assets of households, and access to basic services. And within access to basic services, in some contexts, we ask questions to households if they have access to electricity. So when we are talking about RIMA analysis, we are talking about a huge number of households that have been surveyed. So thousands and thousands of households, but the choice of the questions depends on the choice of the member states. So as an example, so if the state of, if the government of Uganda wants to ask a question about electricity access, it can, but if this government doesn't want to, we don't ask the question. So that's why I said in the introduction, we depend on our member states. We can change to the next slide. RIMA used to be a very large questionnaire, and since 2018, they are changing a bit the approach to have what they call the short questionnaire. And within the short questionnaire, you have the question that is presented on the slide: is electricity the main source of energy used in the household for cooking and lighting? And then you have all the different studies where this question was asked to the different households, and it can measure if energy access, electricity access in this case, it's an important pillar of resilience or not. So then you can, I will let you discover all the results of the studies in the document that are there. You can go to the next slide. Then, of course, we do post-distribution assessment, evaluation, and general monitoring of existing projects, as well as evaluation. So on the first picture is the post-distribution assessment of fuel-efficient stoves in Northeast Nigeria. So we measure the results of our activities. The second one is the evaluation of the country program for South Sudan. So South Sudan, we used to have an important, and we still have an important program on cooking energy. So we do collect extra data. The evaluation office is collecting extra data on the results of the program. And then the third image, it's a project in Syria where we work on the solarization of egg incubators. So we receive pictures and also inspection reports of existing projects to see if the system works, and then to measure if it was adopted by the beneficiaries. And move to the next slide. So then one of the questions that were asked to us during this presentation is, what sort of energy indicators does your organization currently use? And then, yes, so as I said, we collect data on an ad hoc basis. So we're collecting data if we are asked to collect data. And then, of course, we have like different questionnaires. We have focus group discussion guide, and so on and so forth. But the main type of energy indicators that we currently use to then design projects is cooking fuel type and source, cooking practice and fuel usage, quantity of cooking energy and the cost of this energy, willingness to pay, type of food cooked, access to electricity, and amount paid. And then of course, it's not really an indicator, but it's we try to define what is the stock of renewable biomass that is available around the displacement setting. So we kind of create this indicator, and we try to see if there's a gap between the biomass use and the biomass availability. Then of course, so I just put two images. So the first image, it's like a database for Nigeria where we surveyed more than 10,000 households, and then the second one is related to Niger. So the question asked was that if it is a young boy or young girl collecting wood fuel, does he or she is doing it during school time? And it's a proxy indicator to see if it has an influence on education. So we collect all of these indicators, but it's more ad hoc. Can move to the next slide. So what do we need? As I said, we need to know if our programs are working. So that's why, for me, what is the most important is to know if where does the humanitarian energy is going, what's the direction, and also to have standard indicators, because as it says, we can all collect different indicators, but if they are not related to something in common, then we cannot compare between the different agencies. So for me, that's the most important thing, is to have common indicators between the different agencies related to cooking. For FAO, it's the most important one, and also energy access for powering agriculture. That will help us to make feasibility assessments, and then to, of course, design a program. I think it's in terms of choice, is a bit like James was explaining. We can move to the next slide. So what are the core indicators that are needed for us? So I try to differentiate between households and agribusinesses or small SMEs. So for household, it's cooking fuel type, cooking fuel provision method, is it collected, purchased, distributed, the cost, the type of technology, willingness to pay, and then lighting source plus the cost, electricity access, electricity source, and the cost. I think if we have these indicators for household, we would be able to design a project. And for agribusinesses, is the main food production. If the business has access to electricity and the cost, is there also heating is also important in some of the food transformation process. Then annual income and cost, percentage of energy cost in the annual cost, and transformation method. So because we know that if the business is in an off-grid area, then access to electricity would be really expensive. So we need to make sure that the transformation method is energy efficient, and then it will bring financial benefit for the agribusiness. You can move to the next slide. Oops, I'm lost. Okay, so what indicators would be useful? So I think I already answered the question before. So we're interested into needs assessment and program design. And so these are the indicators that I proposed in the former slide. So basically for us, it's like a needs assessment and program design for household and for agribusinesses, because for household, we're interested into cooking for households, and for agribusinesses, how to improve their energy access for increased productivity, reduce food losses, and improve the resilience of agribusinesses in these areas. Next slide, please. Which methodologies do we use? So as I said a bit in the introduction, we use quantitative data, qualitative data, a bit of market data, and situation analysis. So for the quantitative data, we have energy database for Bangladesh, Niger, and Nigeria, and we've been using the Kobo platform to collect this data for Nigeria for sure, and I think for Bangladesh. In terms of qualitative data, we run focus group discussions for which we supply an energy demand assessment, and also for technology choice. So we also run control cooking tests to make sure that if we support one cooking technology, then this cooking technology will be adopted by the beneficiaries. Market data, yes, we do collect market data in terms of energy price for cooking fuels and the different technologies, and also their availability in the local market. And situation analysis, yes, of course, because we know that there are risks and challenges related to wood fuel collection in conflict situations. They have an impact on protection. And we also know that you need to be conflict sensitive in all your program design because natural resources are an asset for some part of the population, and they have a value and they can be traded in different areas of the world. And biomass and wood fuel are sometimes an asset for some of the groups that are controlling the area. So it's important to know a bit about the situation and analyze this. So just as an example, for instance, production of charcoal is used by some groups in Somalia to support themselves during the conflict. We can move to the next slide. So we have a sort of toolkit with a questionnaire for the quantitative survey based on the different surveys we have been doing. So the questionnaire is in English and French. It can be adapted to the situation. So we can remove some of the questions, we can add some questions. Then we have a focus group discussion guide, again in English and French. We are using the controlled cooking test methodology of the Clean Cooking Alliance. Also, we have done English and French version. And then there's also a checklist on forestry operation in displacement settings to know what is the type of operation that are put in place in the displacement settings. Okay, move to the next slide. So where the data is kept, that's the main problem. So basically, we share some of the metadata if we use the Kobo platform, for instance, with the partners. So I will present an example just afterwards. And also, we share the forest inventory data through Open Forest, which is a kind of forestry platform that is available to everyone who would like to register to the platform. In terms of publication, I think I agree with James. Everything is digitized now, so we don't have publications that are non-digitized. Everything is available on the internet, and so in terms of the type of information we share the reports, but not so much the metadata. And then not systemized. Yes, we have metadata that are sitting in different computers of partners, HQ team, regional offices, and country offices. So we do have a lot of data that is available. I'm always happy to share the metadata that is available on my computer with partners and other teams. But we don't have a systemized system in place as of yet. Can move to the next slide. So this is this is kind of an example of where the data is kept. So when we did the wood fuel supply and energy demand assessment for Northeast Nigeria, so it was a collaboration between FAO, UNHCR, and WFP. So what was shared was the end product. So that's the publication you see on the right. Then in terms of the quantitative data that was collected, we had this database that was cleaned by UNHCR country office and then shared with the different partners. The focus group discussion, all the results were also belong to UNHCR, and so they were shared between the different country offices. In terms of forest inventory data, so they were on Open Forest and also shared with FAO Red Plus team, and sometimes it is shared with the local forestry department. So in the case of Northeast Nigeria, I don't think it was shared with the forestry department at the time, but now that we have a better relation with them, it is shared. Same for the GIS data, so it's available on online, and also it's analyzed by the Red Cross team. And you will see GitHub is the processing chain that we use for doing all the what we call the safe assessment. So this is also publicly online through GitHub. So this is just an example to show you where the data sits and how we share it to give you the end result, which is the publication. I think that's it for me. Let's see, no. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm available for any question you may have.
Great, thanks, Florent. Does anybody have any quick clarification questions for Florent about his presentation?
Hello, Sarah. This is Thomas. Can you hear
Hi.
me?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Thanks, Florent. Just a quick question on the resilience index measurement and the RMI. Are displacement settings part of that? I understand it's countrywide assessment, right? Are they
no, we did we choose the size. So for instance, in Uganda, we did one for Karamoja first, so it's in the north of the country, and then one for the western part where you have the refugees. So you select. It's not countrywide. You can do countrywide, or you can do like a specific area. So for Uganda, there was two. So one for Karamoja and one for the western part. I think also, so it was not concerning energy, but in Gaza we did some, West Bank we did some. So we can also segregate the data based on where it is collected, but it's not country by country, because I think also in Senegal they did a specific region.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. Any more questions for Florent? Otherwise, we can move on to Eva. No, great. In which case, Eva, over to you from the IOM.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eva Mach, and I'm an Environmental Sustainability Program Officer in the International Organization for Migration. We also have other IOM colleagues on the call from the CCCM and DTM team. Thanks, guys, for joining. They might want to add something further towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So what kind of data do we already use in IOM that is related to energy? First of all, I just wanted to distinguish really between energy use data for facilities and operations and access to energy data, which is related to projects and programs and how we actually assist affected populations. So in terms of global energy needs data, the most comprehensive set we have is related to the greenhouse gas emission sources from energy production and consumption of IOM operations and facilities. Currently, we have a data set that covers around 80% of all IOM locations. Why are we collecting this data? I think it's very important to highlight what we collect, but also why we do it, what's the purpose. And in case of the greenhouse gas emission related energy data, we are really trying to monitor and report on our environmental performance. In terms of project planning data, what we already use is again related on the one hand to operations and facilities, where we are looking at structures that we operate through projectized funding. And the purpose here is really to assess the feasibility for clean energy transition for these facilities. And on the project and program side, we are looking at access to energy assessments in displacement settings. And the purpose here is to understand really the needs of affected populations and how this can inform programming, not just IOMs, but the whole sectors and again, the whole humanitarian community. We also have research data available, which is context specific, usually country specific, that looks at the reliance of affected communities on natural resources and how they cover their energy needs through those natural resources. And then, of course, we are looking at the related environmental impacts and how we can mitigate them. The purpose here is really to, again, advise projects and programs and how to address these needs, and as well as advising policy based on the evidence that we gather. Next slide, please, Susie. So in terms of the global energy needs data, I mentioned that the most comprehensive data set is available related to facilities and operations. The environmental inventory, which can be called also an environmental audit, is an annual process of collecting data from facilities and operations related to greenhouse gas emissions, water and waste management. This inventory is led by the Environmental Sustainability Program, which is an institutional function in IOM that coordinates organization-wide efforts with the Office of Director General and of other relevant stakeholders to make sure that we mainstream environmental sustainability in a systematic manner and also globally, not just in certain contexts. I already mentioned before that the purpose of this data is to measure our performance, but also to inform priority areas where we can intervene and say, we have the capacity for an energy transition, putting in place, for example, renewable energy infrastructure, or transitioning to a more energy efficient scenario. Next slide, please, Susie. Other use of, the first set of use of project planning data is again related to facilities and operations, because some of our facilities are supported via projectized funding. So some of these structures would be like the humanitarian hubs that other agencies also operate. And the purpose here is truly to understand if there is a way to transition to cleaner energy sources to power these facilities, and of course to look at the different financing options that are available given our financial structures. Next slide, please. The second set of project planning data is really related to context-specific assessments. So on the one hand, we are looking at activity level energy assessments. So for example, life cycle assessments or feasibility studies in WASH programming. And we are also looking at assessments that are part of environmental impact assessments. For example, when we are looking at deforestation as one of the impact of displacement. And usually we do these kind of assessments in partnership with relevant actors, including FAO. So Florent already introduced the different types of projects, and we quite often partner on these. The other big chunk of project planning data could come from the IOM displacement tracking matrix, which is actually the largest source of primary data on internal displacement in the world. And I'm happy to have colleagues from the DTM team on the call. And I said it could because it's not a systematic data collection at the moment related to energy in DTM, but we have seen examples already in the past, for example, in Cox's Bazar, where we were collecting data there, for example, in relation to cooking. So in this case, the purpose of the data is to really inform humanitarian interventions and to inform the relevant sectors, cluster partners, including IOM, what to do. So what are the activities needed? What are the needs that need to be covered? And of course, how to do it? What are those technologies or approaches that are environmentally sustainable and of course, financially feasible? Next slide, please. So I actually wanted to circle every single item here, Sarah, but I prioritized. And when I look at this table, the first thing that really shocked me is how far we are from really having all of this area addressed at the moment. At the same time, everyone is doing something to address them. So one of the key areas that I think data is needed is, well, or at least not data, but partnerships are needed, is to have a common understanding what information is needed, because currently there are so many energy assessments out there with really long questionnaires, but as a sector, we haven't really agreed on what are those questions or indicators that are needed. And this goes back to what Florian was saying about standardized indicators, really the key role that standardized indicators play to be able to have a common understanding and also common programming. And this links back to sharing information, what is everyone doing? And then, because the challenge is so big, and we have limitations in terms of our terms of reference and also our abilities to address certain issues, I think it's very important to look at external partnerships, which the scale of the investment here is really requires private sector engagement. And that's why I also highlighted it on this slide, that we really need to look at what is the data needed for such private sector investment to materialize on the field. In terms of areas of data used by the operations, again, I already mentioned the energy feasibility assessment. So what do people need? Also, what does the organization need in order to be able to operate in certain environments? And also what can help us design better and more effective programs, which again goes back to standardized indicators. Next slide, please. Here I'm just focusing on the access to energy data, because I believe that energy use data for facilities and operations is quite standardized already, in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the UN system-wide environmental audits. So I will just focus on access to energy data for displacement affected communities. So first and foremost, we need data to understand what is needed. So what are the basic energy needs of the communities that we are working with, displaced and also host communities, and understand these needs both at the household and the community level. This can be done as a standalone primary energy needs assessment, looking at, for example, cooking, but also looking at energy needs that enable higher standards of living, like lighting or having connectivity through internet. And then the next question is, who could provide what is needed? Who are those partners who have the capacities to provide what is needed? So basic needs could be covered by the humanitarian sector, but then there has to be a recognition that more complex energy market analysis and looking into the development side, larger scale development requires durable solutions and requires different types of actors as well, from the development sector and also from the private sector, to understand what is available in the given context, and also what kind of market-based approaches we could envisage through the SWOT analysis. Thirdly, how could these energy services be provided? So what are those financial models that would help communities have access to energy? For this, we need to understand the current energy expenditure of households and communities, and of course the ability and willingness to pay for these new types of energy sources or alternatives. And the last one is data related to understanding what type of technologies we should be considering and prioritizing. I think we cannot generalize over certain technologies. I keep hearing solar is a solution. It might be a solution in one context, it's not a solution in another one. Same goes for LPG. So how can we make sure that we have science-based data that is context-specific for a life cycle assessment, so we can really truly compare technologies? Next slide, please, Susie. Oh yes, I left this slide also empty, as James did, because we have been discussing indicators for the past 2 years, and where we stand, I believe, and then colleagues can always correct me, is that we serve the community. So to understand what is needed, we need to first agree on what is truly needed for the communities and who does what and what is the purpose of the data in order to come up with indicators. So I will not spend more time on this. I really hope that the conversations today will help us fill this slide. Next slide, please, Susie. So which methodologies do we already use? We use quantitative data when it comes to facilities and operations. So we are looking at quantity of fuel used and greenhouse gas emission sources. And basically here we are working with Excel data sets, following the greenhouse gas protocol methodology and the environmental audits guidelines. We also have qualitative data, which is again related to access to energy data. And this data is available through the IOM displacement tracking matrix, which, as I mentioned, is the largest source of primary data on internal displacement in the world. And maybe I just focus on the situational analysis. We do have comprehensive assessments in partnership with other relevant actors, but it's not something that we do systematically, and usually they are not shared widely. So we have context-specific data through these assessments, but they are not necessarily shared or highlighted in any way. Next slide, please. So where do we keep our data? So we keep the energy inventory data sets that are related to facilities and operations in-house, and it's available to all internal users through our SharePoint. This is for security reasons, basically. But the global environmental inventory data is published every year on the UN Greening the Blue website. And for the access to energy data, so whenever we collect data through the IOM displacement tracking matrix, it's available on the website for humanitarian actors to use. We also have data that is mission or program specific. The difficulty here is that these missions or programs wouldn't necessarily explicitly mention energy or monitor it or report on it. What happens is that usually energy is more like a component of activities that enable us to have an impact. So we, rather than reporting on this enabling factor, we are just reporting on the impact. So absolutely, this is something we are looking into, how to enhance our reporting on this. Next slide, please. Yay, so if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And again, I have colleagues online. If they want to add something, this is the time.
Great, thanks, Eva. Anybody got any questions for Eva?
Yes, this is Florent here. So the question is related to the DTM. Do you collect any energy-specific indicator within the DTM, or it's based on the demand of the IOM operation?
Okay, so sorry, I actually added the link to one of the DTM questionnaires that already included access to energy, which was related to cooking fuel in Cox's Bazar. So that was an example that we could do it. And currently we are working in-house to see how this can be done systematically. But I have two colleagues from DTM online. I don't know, Alessandro or Rizky, if you would like to add something to this question.
Yeah, Eva, can you hear? Can you hear me?
Very well, yeah.
Yes. Yes. No, that's true. We have. So we collected this indicator in Bangladesh, as Eva said, and we're also now in discussion on how we can expand this, because the thing with the DTM is like what we can put on the table is it's not only the assessment that we're doing, but it's also about the network of information. Usually in places where we have DTM rolled out, we target the whole affected area. So the coverage is supposed to be 100%. meaning then depends on, you know, if the assessment will go up to the location level, the camps, the IDP locations, then we can have a comparable information across all locations, which I think can help more for the analysis. And then there is another discussion in terms of, you know, like under the DTM we have quite a few different data collection exercise, from baseline assessment to multi-sector location assessment. We have some community and household level surveys on different thematic, on different themes. In most cases, when we collect a multi-sectoral location assessment, we include all the different core indicators from the different clusters or different thematic areas. So energy can be one of them, which then can be used to, the idea is to collect as minimum data as minimum but useful data to basically flag if there is a need to collect more information to gather more in-depth understanding of the particular sectoral situation in particular areas. So under the multi-sectoral location assessment, we can collect this preliminary information, for example, what we have done in Cox's Bazar. And then based on that, we can also even tailor, you know, because DTM is also done in rounds. So depends on the places and the information needs. The round can be monthly or bi-monthly. In the onset of natural disaster, for example, it can be weekly or bi-weekly basis. The type of data collected between rounds can also be extended, just in case we need more information, we can modify it on the fly in coordination with everyone else. That's from my side. Over.
Thanks. Any other questions for Ava before we move on to Owen? Nope. Great.
Hi all. This is sorry, Sarah, if I may. This is Ivana. Thanks for the presentation, Eva. I was just wondering whether you would be able to share the indicators, not necessarily the data, but just the indicators that you collect for the facilities, because you said that these are pretty much standardized already and they follow the environmental audit guidelines. If there's a way to sort of get our hands on it, just to understand what those indicators are in one place, that would be awesome. I don't know if that's possible.
Yes, certainly. And I left the link for the UN Greening the Blue website in the presentation. So you will find what we are collecting data on there for basically all agencies. You wouldn't have disaggregated data. You would only get the global figure, but you will have the indicators there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And there'll be lots more time for discussion at the end as well around a couple of these topics. So perhaps we can jump to Owen from Chatham House. And just to flag for everybody on the call so far, the previous three presentations, obviously from IOM, UNHCR and FAO, have been from agencies. So now we turn to Chatham House for the sort of more global and research data perspective. So over to you, Owen.
Thanks, Sarah. And yes, thanks to all of the panelists for the great presentation so far. Just firstly, I'm going to echo James and apologise in advance for any screaming children. But yes, the point that you just made, Sarah, is exactly the one to start with, I think. Chatham House has a very different perspective, I think, to the agencies that we've heard from so far. So I'll try and be quite fast and go through the slides quite rapidly and just highlight ways where our use and approach to data differs from the organisations that have already spoken so far. So next slide, please. So I guess our approach to dealing with data started really in 2015 when we put out a paper called Heat, Light and Power for Refugees, which was, I think, the first study which sought to estimate the global energy use of forcibly displaced people, rather, and to also think about how much they were spending for that energy. And of course, as all of you will not be surprised to hear, the picture that comes back is a picture of tremendous deprivation, refugees and displaced people paying very high costs for very poor energy, and yeah, overall a system that wasn't really working. So we put out that paper in 2015, but we weren't able to put out the underlying data behind that model until quite a bit later. I think it eventually came out in 2017, and we put that up on the Humanitarian Data Exchange platform, which is run by UNHCR. I guess just in terms of what data that was, essentially it's an energy model. So we did quite a lot of very detailed survey work to try to establish some baselines and some assumptions about the way that different camps were using energy, that different populations within camps were using energy. And then essentially we undertook a kind of series of very heroic assumptions to try to generate some global numbers. I'm probably not the best person to speak about this because I'm not a modeler, but I can give some of the overview of that, and hopefully I will if people have questions. Maybe we can go on to the next slide. I guess as a broad principle, what Chatham House is trying to do with the data that we collect is to shed new light on problems, or to highlight something that is going wrong or needs to be challenged or needs to be adjusted. And so, as I mentioned, that paper, Heat, Light and Power for Refugees, looked at the energy use of refugees. At the time, when we did that study, we weren't able to get data on institutional energy use at the same time. It was too patchy, it just wasn't there. And so we kind of followed that up a couple of years later with this other paper you can see here, The Costs of Fueling Humanitarian Aid. And I guess in both cases, what really we were trying to do was to make some judgments, use some kind of evidence-based data to show where things were going wrong and to encourage the international system to try to fix that. So next slide, please. So this very complex looking Excel sheet is essentially the energy model that we used to generate the figures in Heat, Light and Power for Refugees. As I mentioned, it essentially works on the basis of using some very detailed survey work, some interviews, some focus group discussions in a range of countries around the world, and then trying to extrapolate to the information that we found in that to other similar countries. As you can see from the number of tabs along the bottom, it's a very complex model. It's we spent a lot of time doing it. We're very proud of it, but it is nonetheless not intended to be definitive. We're not trying to capture the exact reality on the ground. What we're trying to do is to kind of provide a really simplified overview of what is an incredibly complex system. And so the kind of visualization that I showed you a couple of slides ago on the Humanitarian Data Exchange, the idea when we created that was that people would be able to feed in their own data where they had better data, and that the model would be able to adapt over time. Next slide, please. So when I talk about the kind of detailed surveys that we were doing. I'm slightly drawing away from Chatham House and moving towards the work of our partner organisations and the organisations that we worked with, in particular Practical Action and Energy for Impact, who really did most of the work in developing the surveys that underpinned our model. I think it's worth highlighting that, you know, in some of these initial surveys that we created, these are incredibly long and detailed surveys that, as I say here, 271 questions was the number of questions in one of our initial things, which is obviously way too many, and is a huge burden on forcibly displaced person time, and in fact makes analysis of the findings very difficult to do as well. But I guess it is worth flagging that obviously the benefit of that is that you can take on a huge amount of detail about household characteristics, priorities. You can go through willingness to pay. You can think about a whole different bunch of technologies and solutions and ask people to rank them. And, you know, so yeah, I guess it's a trade-off. We got a huge amount of detailed information, but we probably asked people too much. So next slide, please. Yeah, like everybody, I wanted to highlight everything. I guess, yeah, as Chatham House, as an international affairs research institute, I was looking at these kind of big ones on the left as the priority for our institution. I think it's flagging that I think everybody has highlighted the bottom right, the standardized indicators one. So that's clearly important to all of us. Next slide. So what are the core areas of data that are needed? I thought it might be more helpful to think about what is going kind of wrong in the current data landscape. So from our position as an international affairs institute, the global level picture of energy use in humanitarian settings is obviously only as good as the context specific stuff that's being fed into our partners, being published in the public domain, and obviously being captured in project reports. So if we are to improve the energy access situation in humanitarian settings, we need to provide more evidence-based solutions about what works and what doesn't. I guess the table above, I broadly see three problems. They can be summarized in three, I think. So one is coordination, which I think this working group is trying to overcome and is actually making great strides. The second one is around quality and consistency of data. And the third one is around data governance. I guess just one thought from my side. We haven't talked so far about information that donors require. And there is definitely something, I think, where we could leverage donor influence to encourage organizations to do more in terms of sharing project assessments, monitoring and evaluation data, and actually start to put energy information as standard in kind of reporting documents. So that's something I think that we could think about. Next slide. I didn't want to list out a whole bunch of indicators because luckily I was the last person to submit their presentation, and so I saw that everybody else had got really good ones already. So I would really support the points about willingness to pay and spending patterns. So I think all of this information is crucial for actually assessing what is possible and feasible and what can work in a sustainable way. I think that we as a sector need to do a bit more thinking about what indicators we can use in terms of non-camp populations. I also think we need to do more thinking about heating and cooling. So, you know, particularly, forcibly displaced populations in the Middle East. You know, the winters in Lebanon and Jordan are incredibly cold, and there's lots of people in very inadequate situations there, and there's not a lot going on in terms of indicators about heating and cooling. I guess just the final thing I would really point out here is that I think it'd be really cool to have a discussion about the institutional energy indicators that Eva mentioned, because my feeling is actually that there's a really big disconnect between HQs and field offices when it comes to collecting information about institutional energy use and sharing that. And so I'm not convinced that that is an issue that we've kind of solved, if that makes sense. So I'd be really interested in others' perspectives on that. Next slide. In terms of the type of methods that were used, quantitative stuff, as I mentioned, the model that underpins heat, light and power for refugees. The qualitative stuff is really interesting. Sarah's really great on this, so she will be able to say a lot more about how qualitative approaches can be beneficial for actually really elevating our understanding of how energy is utilized in humanitarian settings. But we did do a lovely paper with the University of Edinburgh on this type of subject. So I've linked to that here. It's really not so much Chatham House, it's really our partners, again, Practical Action and Energy for Impact, but we've done a lot around market-based approaches and using market data to inform the recommendations of what we're doing. We also have a number of documents which try to provide a snapshot of different displacement settings, I guess. Next slide. So this is my last slide. Yeah, I guess what I would, so where do we keep our data? Well, within the organization, I mentioned that the model is kind of shared on the Humanitarian Data Exchange. That's not exactly true. It's all of the indicators are available and you can see how the model comes together, but the actual Excel model is actually only accessible kind of digitally within our organization, and that's an issue, and that's something that we really wanted to make publicly available, but basically we didn't have enough money to do that. Yeah, that's one thing that I would highlight. I guess everything else that we do is available publicly online. So the data set on the Humanitarian Data Exchange, the academic paper on the methodology behind our data modeling, all of our research papers, all of that is available online in various different places. I guess just the kind of final thing that I would say is that really all of us have talked about the kind of standardizing indicators and sharing information. And I do think it's a really exciting time where we are now, because, you know, we have a load of humanitarian agencies coming around the table really interested in how they can do this better. And yeah, a number of institutions in the kind of infancy of collecting energy data. And so, yeah, if we can find ways to define key priorities and coordination mechanisms and ways of working, there's a real possibility here. So that's all I'll say for now. Yeah, look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Owen. Does anybody have any just clarification questions for Owen before we jump into the brainstorm?
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Owen. It's Eva. Just to reflect on the facilities and operations and the related data. I think we need to establish a common terminology, because when we say facilities and operations, these are structures like offices and business operations. I believe that quite often when, you know, external partners are talking about operations, they are talking about, in fact, our projects and programs. So, for example, WASH-related energy needs or energy needs that are related to shelter or health clinics. These would be all under projects and programs. But I'm glad that you raised this, because this is actually something that we were also struggling with when we were discussing with external partners, since we have a department called Operations and Emergencies. So this is just to say, I think we have to be careful where we draw the boundaries for certain data sets. And maybe it's something that we should keep in mind also in the GPA, that we could stick to the UN terminology on facilities and operations, which are again different from projects and programs that are related to serving affected communities. That's one thing. The other thing that we wouldn't be able to share is the economics behind certain energy sources. So that's where I see the biggest gap. So even though we have the quantity of energy use, we wouldn't necessarily have the financial data related to this for each and every specific location. And this is because a lot of these facilities and operations are financed by projects and programs. So that's where we get into a complicated situation where how do you again draw the boundaries? So I think this could be again an interesting conversation to have also with the Greening the Blue team to understand the different system boundaries and how we define operations. Could you just reflect, Owen, on the fact that you didn't manage to get data for facilities and operations, and if you think it was related to what I just mentioned?
Yeah, thanks, Eva. I completely agree with a lot of what you said. Need for kind of more standardization of the language and terminology. I guess what we tended to find was that different organizations held different pieces of the puzzle. And so whilst some, this is just an example, but while some organizations might be able to tell us how much diesel was being used for the generators to power offices, they weren't able to tell us how much diesel was being used to power their fleet of trucks and cars that were moving out every day. And in my mind, that it's not useful to make very kind of big kind of distinguishing lines between those things, because it's still energy use of your organization. And so I guess just, as you say, this broader conversation about what exactly does our terminology mean, what is captured, and who has responsibility for recording it.
Okay, super. So you weren't referring to energy use for projects, facilities that are, for example, located in a displacement site. You were referring to our facilities and operations.
Yes, I was. Although I think the project conversation is still an interesting one as well, right? Like how to capture that information on top of the broad facilities and operations is an interesting conversation as well.
Yeah, and just to add on top of that, just to make sure that we are not raising the expectations here. I mean, our data sets are not perfect. We have data from 80% of our locations, which is over 340, I believe, locations. And of course, they are not perfect. So I also recognize this gap of in data quality, basically. And that's what we are working on as well in-house for the next round of environmental inventories. WFP, for example, has done an amazing job in the past few years on this. It would be really interesting to get their reflections on this. And again, I think it's great that you brought it up, because I keep hearing operations as well, and we always need to clarify what do we mean by them. Same for facilities, by the way. So thank you so much for answering my question.
Great. So now we have about half an hour to talk through some of these brainstorming spaces, including issues like that. Before we just jump into that, I'd like to just sort of recognize that there are a lot of points of alignment here, and there are slightly different terminology uses. And I think that was best highlighted by everybody presenting on the little bubble diagrams on the core areas of data that are most needed, in that lots of people circled similar things but not exactly the same things. So just a couple of points of alignment, and then we can sort of talk through each of these bullet points here and whatever else we wish to discuss. I guess firstly, it was interesting for me to note that almost everybody collected information on household electricity and on household cooking, but that for FAO that mostly focused on wood fuel and forestry, and of course that's looking from their institutional remits. I also thought it was interesting that for the community facilities side, so we talk about wash facilities and street lighting and things there, that was UNHCR collected information on that. I'm not sure so many other operations did, maybe IOM a little bit. And that was Chatham House and UNHCR potentially are interested in energy for operations, as Ava and Owen were just discussing, so energy for offices and staff compounds and that kind of stuff. That actually in terms of IOM's measurement of that focuses on greenhouse gas emissions, and as Ava was highlighting, not necessarily the costs of that, but just the overall energy levels and the overall emissions coming from that. In terms of energy for enterprises, which a lot of us in the energy development world would often talk about productive use energy, I thought it was very surprising that FAO were collecting information on energy for agribusiness. I was actually not expecting that, so thank you, Florent, for highlighting that. But otherwise, other than James's DTU study that he highlighted, there was relatively little information about energy markets within the camps and sort of the small enterprises like phone shops and hairdressers and things within all displacement settings, sorry, not just camps, that collect that information. They were just a couple of things that I wanted to flag as we sort of jump into our data for what discussion, which is the first bullet point there, which is around sort of these three areas of data that we'd initially outlined to sort of focus on, although obviously on the big diagram that people had circled things in red there, you could see that there's really a lot of different types of data that we could focus on. But before this call, several of us had gone through and sort of chosen three areas of discussion that we could focus our discussion around. Global data, which I think came up a lot on the call, sort of what we might call project data or operational data, focused maybe on needs assessments and program design, but also, as Florent was highlighting, looking at what our programs working, and looking more at sort of that side of the operational data. And then the sort of more research data that Owen was focusing on around sort of global data and what do we know overall. I found it very interesting that everybody circled standardized indicators as well. So maybe we can just jump into this discussion. Does anybody have any particular points they'd like to start with on the sort of first bullet point there? Data for what? Things that you really think we need data for this and we need it tomorrow and we should all agree that and get started. Does anybody want to be brave and say yes to the answer to that question?
If I might,
sorry.
If I might jump in. Hey Sarah, it's Judith from African Clean Energy.
Hi.
Super interesting. Thanks everyone for this, because I think it gives us a lot of ideas of what we need to take into consideration as we sort of enter this sector. We're preparing for a couple of pilots for energy for people in displaced settings within northern Uganda, and then we're looking to pilot where we include as many host community families as we do refugee community families, so that we can also compare the two. And I think what I was sort of hoping to hear a little bit more about is how private sector can actually include data collection within their operations, so that we can help supply data where relevant. And that might also then give more perspective on different technologies that are being implemented in different contexts. And if more companies are able to do that and know what to provide, then if someone is able to then compare that data and see what different technologies, what effect they have in what different contexts. I guess for me, the question is, what can we do? What can we include? What should we include? Because we have a lot of integrated data collection for our own use that I think we should be sharing. And I know there's several people on the call that have discussed that with before, but maybe just interesting to include private sector a little bit more in the discussion.
Great, thank you, Judith. That's a really great question. And just to highlight that we're trying to focus a little bit on this call on agency data, which is why sort of the private sector side was more ignored in this particular call, but that's not to ignore it overall. But it's a very good question, and I'm sure others have comments, but just quickly from me, one of the things that we're working on as part of the GPA, we're calling it an indicator mapping, but it's hopefully going to be slightly more exciting than that, is sort of a long list of the different indicators that people might collect, all sorts of institutions, you know, private sector, humanitarian organizations, research organizations as well, and sort of looking at what are the standard ways to collect that, and is there a way to agree on one or two indicators or pieces of information that your business or your operation, like your field operation, could actually always collect that piece of information in a standardized way, so that starts to sort of have this bottom-up effect of creating global energy data that everybody can compare and use. So that would be one side of it. I think the other side is much more for the sort of feasibility assessments and private sector investments. And as you know, probably a lot of UNHCR type organizations will contract out their assessment for a feasibility assessment, and that will itself be done by the private sector, but usually a consultancy, and then use that to tell them what to do. In my mind, that would be an obvious place for the private sector more broadly to come in and sort of support with the types of programming suggestions that you guys already do. But that's much more on the sort of program design side of things, which James and others work on rather than global data. I don't know, James, if you'd like to offer any reflections on that, given your experience with the DTU and Tanzania project.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Judith. Yeah, I think it's a very welcome to have private sector part of the discussion actually about what indicators and data we need. And then as a first step, and then as a second step in terms of sharing whatever you have that would speak to those agreed indicators. So I think that's fantastic. And UNHCR is making baby steps towards kind of development thinking and market-based approaches, and that, you know, programming that is market-based as opposed to sort of historical interventions based on short-term grant funding and distribution of products and services. So that's, yeah, what I would say there. Maybe to answer your question, Sarah, on what do we need at the global level, I mean, UNHCR has obviously committed itself now with the Clean Energy Challenge, and that's out there, and that's an externalization of our own strategy and acknowledging that we cannot deliver on that alone. So I think it really speaks to the GPA community. And so at the global level, we need to come up with the key indicators that track progress, and it's progress towards SDG 7, right? Because that's what we're looking at, SDG 7 in displacement. So how can we sort of unpack that a little bit? And, you know, I'm happy to share the spreadsheet that has all of the indicators and data as it stands for the visualization, the Clean Energy Challenge visualization, and get inputs, you know, and I was planning to share that. Well, I was actually thinking we'd do it in between now and the planned task force workshop, but that's obviously up in the air. But in any case, having this community of experts sort of, you know, provide feedback on that would be great, because I think we need to just, and you know, there'll be some that we can take out, because I think at the moment what we have in that visualization is what we basically whatever we could get our hands on. So there's a lot of data that's from sort of WASH and shelter colleagues who are much better organized. You know, our energy and environment team is behind the curve, if you like, in terms of our grip on the baseline. So there are things that are missing in that, but we don't want to complicate our lives. I don't think we want to go beyond what is necessary for the global reporting. So I don't know, 20 indicators maximum, something like that. And then we can, you know, work out who's got data that speaks to that indicator. So that would be for me, sort of first thing, so that we at least get a better control over the global tracking. And then the project and assessment standardization, that's obviously a much more important in terms of designing new interventions. Yeah, I won't repeat what I said in the presentation, but certainly market-based approaches. I think, wherever possible, that's the guiding principle, as I see it. Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, James. And I see Thomas has raised his hand and therefore might want to ask a question.
Sorry, I was muted. Actually, I wanted to go back to Judith's question and more broadly how to include the private sector into this. And I would see, and I would like to discuss this with Judith and the whole group. I would see, first of all, we need this sort of global data. Let's call it global data. It's not necessarily global as such, but also broad, rough indicators, data, information about certain regions, which can obviously also be aggregated into a global perspective. But I think we need this data to provide some first insights for private actors to get them either attracted to this or interested into this specific displacement setting, or second, to start a procurement process from the agency side, because maybe not so much around household energy, but certainly around energy for infrastructure or energy infrastructure, we have to include a procurement process to green operations, for example, green this infrastructure. And here we need some first rough data, which is the prerequisite for everything else, for the whole procurement process and for developing projects. So in that sense, that's for me the first step to include the private sector. And then the question is, how can we also leverage on additional data that the private sector partners are collecting? Over to you.
Thanks, Thomas. And I would agree that it's very relevant for the larger scale infrastructure. So, for example, decarbonising humanitarian operations by having solar panels, etc., to power that. I think it is as relevant for small scale producers like Bbox and those other types of smaller, medium-sized companies for household power, to know what the households are already spending on electricity and on cooking, and how their business models might be relevant to that. And I think that sort of speaks both to the global data piece, where we're sort of thinking more about the information that general users and policymakers and global stakeholders and SDG type 7 people would be using, but also the project data, which speaks more to the needs assessment and the program design and the intervention, and whether that's intervention with a private sector partner or it's a sort of more traditional humanitarian intervention. So to come on to this sort of global data piece, I'd like to sort of ask the group, is there one core indicator or maybe a couple of core indicators at the global level that you would be really keen to see reflected here? Either one that has already been talked about in the slides, or just one that you as any type of user would be keen to say, look, this is the one or two pieces of information that I would really need as a user to, do programming, to make decisions, whatever you would need that data for. Is there anyone bold enough to make a suggestion?
Hi, Sarah. This is Luke. I'm bold. So, in addition to a lot of the data standards that already exist or that are being developed in the larger SDG 7 space, I would argue that, especially for humanitarian purposes or for situations of displacement, that a few policy or enabling environment indicators are absolutely critical to understand what type of projects or interventions are even possible. And just again, juxtaposing Kenya with Uganda, it will be much easier today to get access to camps, to do market-based approaches in camps, or with urban displaced in Uganda compared to Kenya. So for me, that whole enabling environment, the policy frameworks that currently exist and how it describes access to refugees for energy companies, for energy agencies would be absolutely critical, and one that I actually didn't really see specifically mentioned in any of the presentations.
Yeah, can I just quickly jump in on that, Sarah?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I agree, Luke. And the only thing, and I have thought about this because obviously it's linked to livelihoods and the kind of positive circle of, you create opportunities for income generation, you can afford to buy better quality fuels and electricity, etc. The only thing that we have at UNHCR, which would somehow speak to that as a kind of proxy, I guess, is the work that our livelihoods colleagues have done on labor laws in refugee hosting countries. So the degree of liberalization, as you pointed out, Uganda as opposed to Kenya, Uganda, where refugees are given have the right to work and access public services and earn an income much more freely than they do in Kenya or Tanzania, where there's a much more controlled hosting agreement. And so there's a kind of traffic light. I mean, I don't know if it's data, but I guess it's a classification. I think it's fair enough to use that as data, where it's kind of strict, medium, and liberal. So kind of red, orange, green, and that exists. And I think we could and should use that at the global level. And I guess that's better than nothing.
Agreed, I fully agree. And that's exactly what I was alluding to. It's what is the regime on VAT and duty exemptions for solar or for energy products? What is the current market, the strength of private sector actors to actually even consider market-based approaches? Because that, again, say like Burundi, Central African Republic, it will be much harder to do market-based approaches, not necessarily because of the policy framework, but purely because of the lack of private sector actors that are involved. So all these things that kind of can make or break any a certain type of intervention, I think are absolutely critical as well to capture.
Yeah, no, I agree. And my only concern is that we don't go into too much granular or detail at the global reporting level, because the circumstances will vary a lot. And if the aim of the data is to inform new projects and programs, then that should perhaps be taken out of the global level reporting and put into the program level. Because again, I'm just thinking about and I'll share the spreadsheet with everyone that we have, the data, or the indicators rather, for the Clean Energy Challenge. Ideally, I think that should be comprehensive yet simple, or limited in the number of indicators. And I as always, defer to Sarah here and her superior knowledge on how to design that, because it's a bit of a balancing act, I guess, in terms of detail versus breadth versus depth.
But I could also see quite two different formats for that kind of thing. So it's an excellent point, Luke, and Ivona, who's be listening, that's something for us to think about in the indicator mapping. But I would say that information is both qualitative and it's very contextual. And so I could quite see like a set of reports, for example, that go country or region by region, country by country, looking at those policy environments and using that kind of background data and contextual information to say, look, here is the situation in this country. This is the extent to which the market is liberalized, the extent to which refugees or displaced people have the right to work, and the overall, a snapshot of that type of information. I'm not sure how much of that would be quantitative or markets based and therefore used to inform specific programming, but used to inform general programming, yes, of course. So yeah, very well taken that it's not something that is covered in this on these presentations, and I think it's also something that would be quite useful for the private sector as well, to see the different investment environments essentially in different countries. So other big topics that people might like to discuss under the sort of what is data for and what would be most useful in terms of global data, project data, research data, or perhaps even some standardized indicators. I see a couple of raised hands, so maybe Wafa, come to you.
Hi everyone. So I just wanted to ask kind of on the last point, because I think this idea of the enabling environment for certain types of interventions, in addition to some factors that are more specific to camps, like, where a lot of the migrants have come from and what their kind of socioeconomic background is and all of that kind of stuff. Is there any sort of typology for camps or different types of camps that tries to define on any level the the heterogeneity of like camp settings, or is there nothing really that exists like that at the moment? Yeah, that was my question.
Oof, that's a good question. I'm looking hopefully to James or Ava to answer that, both for sort of displaced people camps and refugee camps, of course.
Sarah?
Yeah.
This is Owen here. Just to say that the model in Heat, Light and Power does group camps according to 5 different types of camp. That depends on the cooking and lighting usage unit. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if that's what you meant by a typology, Wafa, but we have kind of tried to do that. That's what enabled us to scale up from very granular, small level surveys to a kind of global picture.
And is that kind of mapping the energy needs and use in a camp, or is it, because I think kind of what we've been talking, the thing that I picked up on was the idea of being able to define what kind of intervention would be successful in that kind of camp based on kind of the enabling environment. But maybe that would be kind of, I guess, a base level on which more data would. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, I should start by just saying that, you know, that data that we did then is 5 years old, and so much has changed now that it could do with more research on top. But what we do have is, as you say, a baseline, which we then applied different kind of technological solutions on top of to try to work out how much it would change people's access and spending. And so, yeah, we did kind of exactly what you were talking about there in terms of thinking through, if the baseline is X, then what happens when you introduce solar lanterns, or what happens when you introduce kind of a clean cooking cook stove. And it's, you know, there's lots of critiques. You can kind of critique the whole technology-based approach of it, because as we know, technology, you know, one single technology is not going to be a solution in any place. But I think it does give a kind of overview of what changes might be possible and how much it might cost the international system and how much it might cost displaced people themselves.
That definitely sounds like a good starting point for the kind of thing I was thinking about. So I'll definitely go back and have another look at it. Thank you.
Great. And I see Florent has raised his hand as well. Did you want to come in on this point?
So I think it was more on your point where you were saying, like, what are the main indicators that are needed? And I think the Clean Energy Challenge of UNHCR, of course, it covers only refugee settings, but I think it kind of shed the light on the needed indicators. So for me, it would be to talk about like define to the general public and explain what is tier 2 electricity access. Also explain again what is clean cooking, because it's not really understood outside of our small circle. And these are for me, they are the main indicators. And then of course, we as FAO, we are still supporting renewable energy access for food production, so food transformation, solar irrigation, and cold storage, because these are the most important things for food security in displacement settings. But it's just to restate that the Clean Energy Challenge is kind of putting the base in terms of indicator, and it represents an opportunity, I think, for all of us. So I think if we can agree on specific indicators and standards, this might be a very good first step. And also to enter to look comments on the policy and so on. Also, I think the Clean Energy Challenge is also mentioning that refugee and host community, refugee settings should be integrated into broader renewable energy access plans at national or regional level. So I think they are starting to think about like policy and the need for the private sector. I think we did not talk about power purchase agreement, feed-in tariff, and so on, but for me, it's all part of this policy indicators. That's it for me.
Great, thanks, Laurent. And I'm very aware we've only got a couple of minutes left. So just before, I know that people will start to drop off around 3 p.m. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is that we as a group, the GPA, are sort of producing a more detailed consideration on this issue. And if anybody on the call is particularly interested in writing a summary, either of the call today or some of these issues, then please do get in touch. And part of the rationale for doing that over the next couple of months is that we as the sort of GPA working group members are planning to have a workshop that was going to be at the end of April, but we will see if we have to reschedule that due to coronavirus and other things. And the workshop will look at whether it's possible to sort of create a global data task force, taking a lot of these issues forward and not just talking about alignment and the types of indicators, but actually how to collect the data and how to plug that directly into programming. And for that, and maybe Susie can just jump to the very last slide, we're producing 2 outputs for that. One is a sort of detailed indicator mapping, which will take a lot of what was presented today and sort of organize it in the way that Florent was just suggesting, and now will include hopefully policy indicators as Luc was highlighting. And the purpose of that is to bring all of this information together with a little bit of analysis and critical thinking to take this conversation, which was great as a sort of first snapshot for everybody on the call, into what the different agencies are doing, and to take that and actually map that down into what are the different indicators and how are they collected and what types of questions are used. And that's something that Ivona Basaga, who you heard speak earlier, and myself will be doing over the next couple of months. And to go alongside that, myself and Amy Jenks, who I think is on the call as well. Oh yeah, hi Amy. We'll be working on a evidence ecosystem sort of concept note, which many of you will have seen the sort of extensive crazy diagram with all the blue and purple swirls on it as part of these presentations. It'll sort of take that diagram and others and work that through into what are all the different types of data and evidence needed in this space, and from that what are the priority areas that agencies, private sector, research, etc. will need to work on at quite a light touch, because at this stage in the process we're very much just trying to bring together what has been learnt so far by many people on this call, and reflect that to a wider audience. So I guess we just have a couple more minutes if anybody has any questions or comments or things they'd like to ask as part of the closing discussion.
Sarah, could I just thank Florent for his last comments. I completely agree. I'm sitting here nodding at what he said, and yeah, about the need to sort of rationalize the global, the indicators for the clean energy challenge, sorry, and I think that would be a great next step. And then earlier on, I made a note about on the point of power, institutional energy use. WFP have done a lot of really good work. Georgina Stickles leads their work on this, and it's a shame that they're not on the call today, because I think we could learn a lot from them in terms of what indicators they've used and how they gather data. There's a thing called Fleet Wave they're using for their vehicles, and they have a pretty good understanding of how much fuel they're using for how much, etc. So I think, yeah, hopefully get them in the contributing at a later stage. And thanks to you, Sarah, by the way, but this is the last thing I'll say. Thank you very much, as always, Sarah, for being the brains of the operation and all your hard work for this. I really appreciate it. I think we all appreciate it. Thank you. Cheers.
Of course, I'm not sure I'm the brains. I think I'm the typist at this stage. But does anybody else have any comments or things they'd like to reflect on before we close the call? And sorry, there wasn't as much time for debate as we'd imagined, but I think it was important to hear from the agencies and from Chatham House about what they've already done and sort of share that knowledge with the wider group. So does anybody have any final questions they'd like to ask or comments to make?
If I may, Sarah, it's Judith again from ACE. If anyone has had experience on externalities, or I know it was raised earlier, there's a CO2, and what can be done around carbon finance. We're super interested in looking at that in this context because it's something that we're doing outside of the refugee context already, and we want to know if anyone has any experience. So if anyone's interested in that, please do reach out.
Great, thanks, Judith. Perhaps I could just make a note there to my UNITAR colleagues to pass that on to whoever is now chairing the chairing the private, whatever the private sector working group is called now, because I remember that was something, especially the carbon finance issue, that we discussed even in Berlin, and I'm not sure if we made any movement on that, but if other parties are interested in that, maybe you could link up, Judith, with those people. Great, okay, in which case I think I probably have to close the call because everybody else has other meetings to get to, etc. And just to flag that our next call is likely to be in June, and we were hoping to focus on quantitative data for market-based approaches in humanitarian settings. There are now quite a few projects that have been starting up over the last sort of couple of years, including the Moving Energy Low Carbon projects and the RE for our Practical Action in UNHCR. Renewable Energy for Refugees project in Rwanda and Jordan that have quantitative data to share. So our next data call might be more focused on the actual numbers and some of the quantitative statistics that are coming out of those programs. So if anybody has a program like that you'd like to share results from, please do get in touch. And we will be in touch ourselves about the potential April workshop, if that's changed to June or whatever for the wider group. So with that, I'm sorry we ran a little bit over time, but I'd like to thank everybody, especially our speakers, for contributing our calls, and we will share both the recording and the presentations afterwards for follow-up and more information. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sarah. Cheers.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, great.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.